Hey there, in this video we are going to take a look at how to make generative music on the Sonicware Texture Lab. I am going to be showing you two different approaches, each of which has its own strengths and drawbacks, and with both of them I'm going to start with a very simple basic version of the technique, and then we're going to build on it to come up with something a bit more advanced and sophisticated. Along the way we are going to go from making very slow ambient music to something that is a bit faster and more melodic. Okay, so the way that I think about generative music is that it is music that is automatically generated by the combination of a certain set of predefined rules and a certain amount of randomness. Or another way of describing it would be that it is music generated by a system of rules, and some of those rules involve an element of randomness. Anyway, let's start with randomness. Now, there are two ways of creating randomness on the Texture Lab, and the first one I'm going to show you is the simplest. For this one, all we have to do is we need to change our mode from polyphonic to arpeggio, which will automatically arpeggiate whatever we play. And sometimes with a sample like that, you can't even hear the arpeggiation because the notes kind of blend together unless you turn down the release. So let's do that. Turn up the volume here a bit. And so there we go, we are arpeggiating. Now there are a number of different patterns you can use for arpeggiating on the Texture Lab. We access those by going function and then the adjust button here, and the default one is going up, but we have a number of other options, including random, which is the one that we want here. And actually let's turn down the BPM on this so we can hear it better. Notice how the order that the notes is being played in is being randomized. However, even though normally when we're arpeggiating on a synthesizer, we would be playing chords, there is nothing stopping us from playing more notes than that. In fact, if we hold down this OK button here, or really the hold button, we can put in as many notes as we want into our arpeggiation. And so if I wanted to, I could input every single note in this entire octave. So let's try doing that. And now, thanks to the fact that I pressed the hold button, I can let go. And if I want to, I can now start making adjustments with the knobs. And the moment I want to stop playing this, I just have to go clear, hold. Okay, so that's the easiest way to get some randomness going on the Texture Lab, but, well, it didn't really sound that musical. I mean, it just sounded like someone was going. And in a sense, that is exactly what was happening. We were just automating that procedure. So how can we make it more musical? Well, for starters, one thing we can do is we can slow things down even further. Now, we can't go below 40 beats per minute on the Texture Lab, but we can change the note value from the default 16th notes all the way down to something like quarter notes. And now if we do the same thing as before, it's going to sound like this. So that's already a lot prettier than what we were hearing before. Something about slowing it down makes it a bit more ambient. However, I wouldn't really want to listen to that for more than maybe like 30 seconds because it does get a bit monotonous, and that is because, well, it is monotonous. And to understand why it's monotonous, I think it helps to think about this in terms of what are the underlying rules that we are using for this generative music that we are creating right now. Now, you might think, okay, we're not really using any rules, we're just putting in a bunch of random notes and then letting them play out. But there actually are some implicit rules in what we are doing here. For one thing, we are defining the range of notes that are possible. We are essentially telling the Texture Lab, okay, I just want you to play notes within this octave here, inside the key of C, or at least the key of C on the keyboard. I don't know what key the original sample is in. And by the way, that sample is actually just me blowing air across the opening of an empty wine bottle. You can actually create some really cool samples just by using everyday objects like that. And I would really encourage you to try that out because it's a lot of fun and you can get some really nice organic sounds from it. Anyway, so that is one rule play inside of this octave. I guess you could also say there's an implicit rule about the sample that we're using. We're defining the sound that the Texture Lab must use. And then the other rule that we're defining here is, well, there's two parts to it. On the one hand, we are defining the tempo at which the notes are being generated. And then we are also defining the note value as a quarter note. And so what we're basically telling the Texture Lab is, okay, with every quarter note at a tempo of 40 beats per minute, I want you to play one random note from this selection of notes here using that sound that I've told you to play. So those are the rules. Then the randomness is which note gets selected. Okay, so if our music is monotonous, that must be because of the rules that we're using, and we're going to need to change one of them to make it less monotonous. Okay, so let's start with the rule about which notes to play. The rule that we just want to play notes in this octave, in this key. Could that be the reason why our music is monotonous? Well, I would argue no. And to show you why, let's go out of arpeggio mode to monophonic mode for a moment and think about this octave here for a moment. Now, this might not seem like many notes, but something I want you to think about is how many notes are involved in some of the most famous melodies that you know. For example, here is Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Did you see that? We're actually just playing these notes here, so we're not even going a full octave. Just those guys. Just 5 notes to create that whole melody. Let's do another one. Okay, so that entire melody can take place in that same octave. Now, if we go into the next part, we have to dip down a little bit lower, but there's actually just, I think, one note that goes outside of that octave, and for the most part, the entire melody takes place within this octave. And I could just multiply the examples from here. But I think you get the idea. So we really just need an octave to work in to create some interesting music. And although having more than one type of sound can help, we also don't need to have more than one sound. We were able to play those melodies just using this single sample. So that can't be the reason for the monotony either. And that just leaves one possibility left, which is that it must come down to the rhythmic element of our music, which is basically non-existent at this point, or rather the only rule that we have in place is just play one quarter note after another. And there's never any rhythmic variation in that, and that is one of the crucial aspects of a melody, which is not just variation in the tones, but variation in the rhythm. Put those two kinds of variation together and you have melody. Okay, so now let's go back to arpeggio mode and think about how can we introduce some rhythmic variation into this. Okay, so we just have these quarter notes playing one after the other. The simplest way that we can shake things up here is to somehow interrupt some of those notes from playing so that we have either pauses in between them or some of them are longer than others. How can we do that? Well, we can use the sequencer combined with the velocity parameter, the secondary parameter on this knob here, the one whose primary function is the blend. So to start with a simple version of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pattern length and I'm going to reduce it down to, let's just do 2 for starters. Okay, and now I'm going to enter into parameter recording mode by going function and this parameter button here, which turns red. I'm going to enter into sequencer recording mode, hold down shift, and then with this knob here, I'm going to turn the velocity on step 1 down to 0, and then on step 2, I'm going to set it to 100. Okay, let's exit out of all of that, and now I'm going to hold down my arpeggio. Still just playing quarter notes, but now if I turn the sequencer on, well, notice how we cut out on that first step, and then we only play something on the second step. Okay, so now that we have that in place, what we can do is we can turn the random option on our sequencer, and then down here, continuing to hold down the function key, we select this key that says setting and press it twice. We'll get to the random options here, which dictate when our randomness takes place, either every 1 step, every 2 step, every 4 steps, or so on and so forth. And for this, we want to randomize every single step. Okay, and now if we do the same thing as before, well, I don't know if you noticed that, but usually we were just flipping back and forth between the 2 steps, but sometimes the second step got played twice in a row, leading us to a little bit of rhythmic variety, sort of like do, 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 something like that. Okay, so that's just the basic idea here, and now we can expand on it a bit. So for example, we could change our pattern length to 4, and then for the third step, we could set the velocity to 100 again, and then for the fourth step, let's actually just go to 50. So what we're basically saying here is, okay, Texture Lab, I want you to roll a die on each step of the sequencer, and 50% of the time, on 2 out of the 4 steps, I want you just to play whatever note's been selected randomly at 100% velocity. 25% of the time, I want you to play it at 0%, and 25% of the time, I want you to play it at 50%. And so now, in addition to some rhythmic complexity, we are also going to add a bit of complexity in terms of the strength with which the notes are being played. Dynamic complexity, I guess you could call it. But in any case, that is going to sound like this. Let's turn up the BPM on this. And let's also turn up the release. And that is just with 3 notes. If we want to go back to having our entire octave, that's now going to sound like this. Increasing the release some more here. Now let's turn our BPM back down. Okay, so we're getting somewhere with this, but we still have a bit to go because we have those long gaps of silence in between the notes. And it would be nice if instead of silence, we had the last note just ring out. And that way we'd have short notes punctuated by longer notes. And then we would really be starting to get somewhere melodically. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, for starters, we can put our release on the maximum value. That's going to sound like this. But we're still getting a bit of silence there at the end. The last note isn't ringing out through the entirety of that gap. So what we need to do now is make our actual sound a bit more pad-like, a bit more sustained. I've already created a whole video on how to do that, which I'm going to link to below or above. I don't know where it's going to go. And I'll also put it in the description. So I'm just going to do this in fast motion. Okay, so I've gone ahead and made the sound much more pad-like. Now it can just ring out and ring out and ring out. And now if we play our sequencer and hold down our notes, we get something that sounds much nicer. Okay, so anyways, that is how we can use velocity and randomization on the sequencer to start creating some rhythmic variety in our music with those notes that we are randomly selecting from. But we can step up the complexity here even further by making fuller use of our sequencer. So to show you this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear all of those current parameter values by going clear and then the parameter button here. And now I'm going to increase the length of our pattern to 16 steps on the sequencer. And now going back into recording mode on the sequencer and parameter recording, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to split the sequencer into 4 different sections. We have these 4 steps here, that's section 1, these 4 steps here, section 2, section 3, and section 4. So I'm going to think about those as kind of distinct units. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hold down the shift here by going shift function so that this lights up. And now I don't need to hold it down to access the secondary parameter values on the knobs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a kind of pattern here where, for example, with this first section, I'm going to make the velocity of the first step be 100. And then for the subsequent steps, I'm going to set them all at 0. So we have 1 step on, 3 steps off. Now I'm going to continue. I'm going to go 2 steps on and then 2 steps off like this. So 100, this next one at 100, and then the next 2 I'm going to set at 0. So 1 on, 3 off, 2 on, 2 off, and next I'm going to do 3 on and 1 off. And then finally, for this last one, I'm going to make them all be 100. Now what I'm going to do is this. So I'm going to go back into the settings for randomization, hitting this key twice. And now I'm going to set this number here from 1 to 4. And so what that's going to do is it's going to randomize things in chunks of 4. So for example, maybe it'll start here and play this chunk of steps, and then it will jump to this chunk and play these steps, and then it will jump to this chunk and play these steps. And so we're going to alternate between these rhythmic patterns of either just 1 step being played or 2 steps or 3 steps or all the steps. And that is going to sound like this. Okay, now there wasn't anything special about that particular pattern that I used, and you could mix things up here and build on this quite a bit. So for example, instead of doing 1 step on, 3 steps off, you could do like 1 step on, 1 step off, 1 step on, 1 step off, or 1 step off and then 3 steps on. And I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities just using increments of 4. And you also don't need to do just increments of 4 because with the randomization, remember that you also have options for 8 or even 16. So for example, you could come up with patterns that consist of 8 steps each and then randomize by 8 steps at a time. You could even go up to 16. And then remember, you have 128 steps to work with, 8 whole pages of 16 step sequences. So you could come up with 8 distinct patterns of 16 steps each and randomize between those. And there's really a lot of room for possibility here, except for one thing, which we can't do using this method of generating music on the Texture Lab, which is that because we are in arpeggio mode, we can't play chords. We're only ever going to play 1 note at a time, and there's no way around that using this technique. And that brings me to the second technique, which is going to utilize polyphonic mode and is going to approach this from a whole different angle. So let's look at that next. I'm going to once again clear our pattern. And so with the previous technique, when we were using the sequencer, we were basically just using it to sequence parameter change values in our velocity parameter value. But we can also, of course, just sequence notes and randomize their playback on the sequencer. And that is the other way of randomly creating music on the Texture Lab. So for example, we could just input our same sequence again. And let's change randomization back down to 1. And let's decrease our sequence length to just these 8 notes here, these 8 steps here, and let this play. Okay, so we're getting random notes, but now we're back to having things be monotonous because we're only ever playing one quarter note after another. It'd be nice to have some more rhythmic variety, and there's a couple ways of doing that on the sequencer. The simplest way is just to increase your pattern length. Let's go back to 16, for example, and then just leave a bunch of blank steps in the sequence, and that's going to automatically insert occasional pauses in between the notes. And so that will sound like this. And if we want more or fewer pauses between the notes, we just have to increase or decrease the sequence length. So for example, we could take our sequence length and reduce it down to, 11. So this way, probabilistically, we have a 3 in 11 chance of having a pause, whereas we have an 8 in 11 chance of playing a note. And so now that's going to sound like this. Okay, now to me, this still sounds a bit monotonous. Although we are always randomly playing a different note with each step or an occasional pause, we're never doing anything other than just playing a single note. We never have multiple notes being played at the same time. And so although things are unpredictable in terms of which note is being played, they're completely predictable in terms of there's only ever going to be one note played at a time. And if something is predictable, well, that makes it monotonous. So to get around that, one thing that we can do here is this. So I'm going to clear all the notes from our pattern and let's increase our length back to 16. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go an octave down. So down to here. And actually even playing around with the filter here, that's too low to here. So let's actually turn up the pitch on everything. Okay, so now we're in a whole different key. You're gonna have to play around with the pitch values to see what works with the particular sample that you're working with. But in any case, what I'm gonna do here is first I'm gonna lay down a sequence of chords. I'm gonna do one chord per section of 4 notes. So I'll do this chord for steps 1 through 4, tying them all together. I'm gonna do this chord for steps 5 to 8. This chord for the next section, and this chord for the last section. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up an octave to the middle octave, and I'm going to input those notes from our octave onto the sequencer on top of those chords. Okay, so that's our octave once, and then I think I'm just going to repeat our octave over here. Okay, so now if we randomize the playback here, it's going to sound like this. Okay, so now we have some nice variety with notes being combined in different ways. However, now we're back to having rhythmic monotony because we're always playing some notes on every step. We're always playing quarter notes. So to add some rhythmic complexity, let's add a few steps to our sequence. Let's go up to, let's try 30. So now on the second page, we have some more steps, and I'm just going to leave them all empty so that we will insert some random pauses in between the steps that do get played. And so now that's going to sound like this. And once again, if I want to adjust the frequency of the pauses. I just need to increase or decrease the number of extra empty steps I have in the overall sequence. In this case, I would probably want to decrease the number of steps because the pauses were a bit too frequent. And that sounds like that. Okay, now we still got a bit of monotony going on here because although now we are combining notes together, well, we're only combining notes together. If a sound does get played, it's always going to be multiple sounds getting played at the same time. If we want to add some variety to that, well, we should program some notes into our sequencer where sometimes we're just playing one note at a time, so that sometimes we have little monophonic bits of music being played, and other times we go back to polyphony. Let's do just a 50-50 split between those two things. I'm going to increase the pattern length to 32, and on this second page of the sequencer, which we're in right now, I am going to put in our octave, and then I'm just going to leave these last 8 steps empty so that we still have the possibility of pauses. And so now we're going to sound like this. And those monophonic notes don't really sound that much different than the polyphonic ones because when they get played, the notes from the previous polyphonic ones are still ringing out, and so they still kind of overlap. To prevent that from happening, we'd have to decrease the release on this. Let's try that. And there you go. Okay, so now let's look at increasing the BPM on this and playing something a bit faster. So let's just try going to 120 and let's change our note value back to a 16th note, so the default settings. And now that's going to sound like this. Super, super fast and lots of overlapping notes. Let's decrease the release further here. And let's decrease the BPM a bit. Okay, so I mean, it's kind of a cool sound, but it's not really that musical. It's not that melodic. It's just lots of notes being played really quickly, and it would get tiresome pretty quickly as well. So what's the problem here? Well, I think one of the main problems is that we are not just playing notes really rapidly and changing between tones really rapidly, but we're also changing between chords really rapidly. I mean, there's a chance that a chord will be repeated, but often we'll be going from one chord to another chord to another chord, one step after another, which is much quicker than chords normally change in music. Normally, we would sustain them for at least 4 steps, maybe even longer. Something like that, and not. Which especially doesn't work with this particular sample here. So let's actually change our sample. I'm gonna go to this guy here, decrease the pitch. And let me undo some of these parameter changes I've put in. Okay, there we go. So this is a sample that I've used in other videos. It's basically just a plucked string on an electrified violin. And let's go back to playing our sequence here. Okay, that sample sounds a lot more appropriate for faster music like this. And I think it also illustrates the point I was just making, which is that we are really shifting between chords too rapidly. We're going like... It just doesn't sound that great. It would be nicer to have something like... where the chords are sustained over longer periods of time. Okay, so how can we do that? Well, to give you a simple version of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear our pattern once again of all the notes, decrease the length back down to 16, go back down an octave, and I'm going to do the same chord progression. So steps 1 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 12, and our final 4. And now, once again, I'm going to go back up an octave, and I'm going to put in the notes of our original octave. And for this one, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same octave again, but I'm going to go backwards. Okay, so now if I play our sequence, it's going to sound like this. And we can hear those chords being changed way too often, but the way we can prevent that from happening is by accessing our random note value and setting it from 1 to 4. And so remember, what that's going to do is it's going to randomize the playback of the sequencer in chunks of 4. And since we programmed chords into those chunks, it's going to hold the chord for 4 steps at a time while playing those higher pitched notes on top of the chord. So that's going to sound like this. Okay, so that improves one thing, but now we're back to having total repetitiveness with the notes that are getting played. We're always playing just 16th notes, one after another. And now we can't employ the same trick that we employed before of adding extra steps, extra empty steps to our sequencer. Because, for example, if we go up to 24, so now on the second page we have some empty steps, and we play this. Well, it doesn't work because, for one thing, we are playing these whole chunks all at once, all 4 steps in a row, which adds like a big pause in between these different sections that are filled up. But we're never actually interrupting the notes that are inside of these sections, which is what we really want to do. So let's decrease our length back down to 16. And now we're going to look at the final option that we have for randomness on the Texture Lab. And it's the one that's going to really help us to take this to the next level, which is per step randomness. So to access this feature, all we have to do is hold down the OK button and then press a step, and you'll see the word none. That means no probability has been assigned to this step. But if we just toggle the value knob up here, we can go from 100 all the way down to 25. So 25 meaning we have a 25% chance now of this individual step being played when it gets triggered, or we could make that probability 50%, or we could go up to 100%, and we can't go below 25%. That is the minimum. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. And you don't have to do it this way. This is just a way of doing it. But my thinking here is that the first step of each one of these 4 sections, the 1, the 5, the 9, and the 13, those are our downbeats. And I want there to be a pretty high chance of them playing. So I'm going to set the probability to 50 on those. So 50% on the 1, and then 50% on the 5. By the way, you have to press OK and then the step again. You can't just go from one step to another. So OK, step 9, set that to 50, and then OK, step 13, and set that to 50. And then I want there to be a much lower probability of the other steps being played. So I'm going to set those all the way down to the minimum value of 25. So 25 on every single other step. And I'll fast forward through this. Okay, there we go. And if you ever want to check the probability values that you've assigned, all you have to do is press OK and then press the step, and you'll see them in action. So we have 50, 25, 25, 25, 50, 25, 25, 25, and so forth and so on. Okay, so now if I play this, here is what we're going to get. So we're starting to get something much more musical than what we had before. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, well, we've reintroduced some rhythmic complexity. We're not playing chord changes as rapidly as before. But there's one other thing that I've done here, which I think is really important and which I should probably draw attention to, which is the fact that I put in the notes in a sequence. I took these notes here from this octave and I didn't put them in just randomly. I put them in one after another, either going up or going down. That's important because what it means is that if 4 notes get played in a row, like these ones here, they're going to go up one interval at a time. Or maybe it'll be these 4. Or it could go down one step at a time, like that, or like that. And if notes don't get played, well, we'll skip 1 or 2 steps, like this, or like this. But we're not going to have a bunch of huge leaps, which isn't something that most melodies do. If you analyze the average melody, you'll find that most of the notes are really close to each other. For example, let's go back to the Ode to Joy. It goes. Notice how I'm always just going a single step on the keyboard. Always just a step. There's never any big leap like that, and we certainly don't have one big leap after another, which is what happens if we just play a bunch of notes randomly like we did earlier. Now, of course, it's fine to have an occasional leap in a melody. In fact, many melodies do that, like Somewhere Over the Rainbow. I mean, that's one of the most famous intervals in music, and it's an interval of an entire octave from this C on the keyboard to this C. However, notice what happens after that. We have that huge leap, but then we go down just a single step. And then we skip just one step to go down to here. And then we go back up a single step, single step, single step. So, in faster motion. So most of the action is just happening here, and it's happening with just single step intervals or skipping one step, but we don't have a bunch of leaps in a row. And if you analyze other melodies, you'll find the same thing happens over and over again. So anyways, that is the rationale behind what we were doing here, which leads to the result that we have. Now, I was just sticking to 16 steps here for illustrative purposes, but that is a bit limiting. And in this case, what it's doing is it's making it so that on this chord here, the one that's down here, the only 4 notes that are ever going to be paired with that chord are these notes here. And then for the next chord, this one, the only 4 notes that are ever going to be paired with that are these guys. And they're always going to be played in ascending order. And then same thing with this section here and this section here. It's only ever going to be 4 notes assigned to those chords, and they're only ever going to be played in descending order. Now, to make things less monotonous, it would be nice if for each chord, for example, this chord here, we could have these 4 notes playing ascending or descending, and same thing with those other 4 notes. Instead of having just those 4 notes ascending locked into the chord. Or if we wanted to make things even more complex, it would be nice to have other ascending and descending sequences of notes. For example, there's no reason we have to start on this note here and go up 4. We could also start here and go up 4 like that, or go 4 down like that, or go 4 up here. or 4 down. You get the idea. However, in order to program that into the sequencer, we're going to need to have a lot more steps. In fact, it would help if we had all 128 steps to work with, but that presents a problem, which is that, remember, in order to get the rhythmic complexity, what we need to do is press OK and then insert a probability value on every single one of the steps. And if we had 128 steps, well, we'd have to do that 128 times, which would be very, very tedious to do, which I can report to you as a fact because I have gone ahead and done it. I know I'm a madman. So what I've done here is I've created a sequence I've called Generative, which if I can remember how to use the Texture Lab, we'll be able to access. Okay, there we go. And yeah, so for this, we have 128 steps. All the pages are filled up, and on every single page, in every single section of every page, a section being what I'm calling 4 steps, we have the first step having a probability of 50, and then the subsequent steps have a probability of 25, and then that pattern gets repeated over and over again. Now, this was such a pain to set up that I don't want anyone else to waste their time the way that I did. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to include a link to allow you to download this pattern that I've created, and also put in a link to a video by Chris Lodi that shows you how to download stuff onto the Texture Lab, or really onto any Sonicware Live-In device. Okay, so now that I have this pattern in place, what I can do is this. So I am going to go into the very first step, go back down an octave, and I'm just going to do the same chord sequence as before. So this is my first chord, but I'm going to stretch that across 2 entire pages of steps. So now the entire first page and the entire second page are all just that chord. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the third and fourth pages. Go to the first step of the third page, play that chord, hold it, press the next page button, and now I'm going to tie all of those steps together like that. And then because I have auto step on, we automatically advance to the next page, where I'm going to do the same thing again, go up to my next chord, stretch it across 2 pages, tie them all together, and now I'm going to do the same thing with my final chord on the final 2 pages, tie them all together, and there we go. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I am going to go back up an octave, go to my very first step on the very first page, and I'm going to start putting in my notes from my original octave. So I've just gone just like before. And now on this half, I'm going to do the same thing, but descending. So, and I messed that up, which brings me to a good point, which is that it's really easy to do this too quickly and to accidentally input a note onto 2 steps at a time if you have auto step on. So I would suggest doing this slowly. I am going to have to clear this entire first 2 pages of notes. I'm going to fast forward through doing that. And now redo that. So put in my chord, go back to the first page, go back up an octave, and now nice and slowly put in my notes. Okay, so now that chord can be combined with any of those 4 possibilities, the first or second half of our octave being played either ascending or descending. And now we have this whole second page of the same chord to work with, and I don't actually know what I want to do with this. We have a few possibilities here. We could try starting with different notes and then go up or go down, but which note to choose, I don't know. And one thing we could do here is we could try to think about how could we do this in terms of rules. Like, what rule could we be following here? And one rule that comes into mind is that, so we have an underlying chord like this one here that consists of this note, and this note, which are also part of our octave up here. We could make a rule that for this second page, what we're going to do is we are going to start on the root note of that chord. So this guy here, an octave up from where we're playing it with the actual chord, and we could use that as our starting note. So start here, go up, and then go back down. And now we have 2 more sections to work with. And for this one, I have an idea, which is that, so far we have the possibility of having a pause in between notes. So for example, this note could get played and then this one could not get played and then this one would get played, in which case this note would ring out for this whole space here, but we could increase the possible length of a note being played by taking just a note. In this case, let's do the root note of our chord, this guy here, and stretching it across the entire section. And just to keep this simple, let's actually do that twice. So now we're doubling the probability of that happening with this particular chord. Okay, and now we're on to the next chord, the one that starts down here. So on the first page, I'm just going to do our octave ascending, and then descending. And then on the second page, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our chord, so remember this guy, which we're also playing up here in our octave. Actually, this note is outside of that octave, but that's okay. So I'm just going to start with the root note and go up and then go down. And then I'm just going to hold the root note for both of those last sections. Okay, and now I'm going to do the same thing here. Ascending, descending, okay, and then root note, which for this is going to be this note here, up an octave, so right here. And this time we are going to go outside of that original octave, but hey, you know what, that's okay. So on that step, start going up, then down, and then let's just hold it. And then same thing on our final two pages. So remember, this chord is this guy. And here, well actually, so if we were continuing in the same way as before, we'd go all the way up here. But then we're really outside of that original octave. But for this chord, we actually have enough room here to go all the way back down to here and just start playing our notes starting on the root note here. So like so. And then back down. And then hold and hold. Oh, and actually I mixed that up. I should have started doing just our up sequence and our down sequence on the octave, but that's okay because the probability is going to be the same no matter which page we put things on. So let's just go here and then go up. Okay, so now all of that is programmed, and let's see what that sounds like. And if we wanted to, we could slow down this all the way back down to ambient territory, and then we'd have to change our sound a bit to make it more pad-like. So I've made the sound more pad-like. Let's hear what that sounds like. So, not too bad. And we haven't even gotten into parameter changes here, but I think this is enough for this video. But one thing I want to leave you with is, well, two ideas. First idea is, it's not really generative music if you start manually changing the parameter values, because now there's an element of human control, but hey, you know what? That's okay. It's not like Brian Eno is going to come and yell at you. So that's one thing you can do, and this can be a fun way of like playing around with the parameter values while having some actual music playing alongside of it. But the other thing you can do is this, if you want to get into kind of more experimental territory. So I'm going to change the BPM to as high as it can go, and I'm going to change the note value to as high as it can go. So now it's going to be playing super, super fast. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start doing random changes on the knobs and just see what happens. So I'm going to go into parameter recording mode, play this, and then just go to town on changing these guys around. Could even change the direction here of the playback. Okay, so now I have no idea what this is going to sound like, but we've baked in all of those changes to the steps in different random places. And now if we change our BPM to something lower and set our playback down to something slower, now it sounds like this. Actually, I'm going to increase the BPM just so we don't have to sit around and wait for it to happen. So yeah, that wasn't my favorite result that I've gotten from doing this, but that's part of the fun here, is just experimenting and seeing what you get. And sometimes it'll sound good, sometimes it won't sound that good. Just one last little idea for something to play around with. And of course, there's all sorts of other things you could do with this underlying foundation of the technique I've shown here. For example, you could do 8 chords instead of 4 chords, or you could do a different selection of notes, maybe a wider selection of notes, or a narrower selection of notes, or a selection of notes that goes like here and then here and skips these notes here. And you could do different patterns with the notes. You could ascend or descend from different places, or you could, for example, instead of doing it in increments of 4, you could do increments of 8 or even 16, or maybe go down to 2. I don't know. I mean, there's lots of possibilities here, lots of room for experimentation. The point of all of these examples is just to give you a basic idea of some of the possibilities on the Texture Lab. All right, so remember to check out the links in the description, and I'll leave it there. Have a great day, and goodbye for now.